The desert was quiet that night, but not silent. The wind moved softly through the mesquite trees, carrying the dry scent of sand and smoke. The moon was heavy and low, spilling pale light across the rough land. In the distance, a lone coyote cried out, and for a moment it felt as if the earth itself was holding its breath. She stood by the window of the small wooden cabin, her fingers gripping the sill so tightly her knuckles turned white. Tomorrow was no longer just a day away. It was already pressing down on her chest, a weight she couldn't shake. Tomorrow her life would no longer be her own. Her father had spoken the words with no hesitation, his voice flat as if he were bartering for a sack of grain or a horse. He said it as though she were nothing more than something to be traded, something to be sold. She had stood frozen, listening, her stomach twisting, her heart breaking, her throat dry. She could not cry. Not in front of him. Tears would only make her seem weak, and weakness in that house was never forgiven. But when night came, when shadows spread across the walls, the reality cut deeper. Tomorrow her future would belong to someone else, bought and paid for with no regard for her soul. She pressed her forehead to the glass, wishing for escape, for wings, for something greater than the chains around her. And yet fate had its own way of working. Beyond the cabin, beyond the fence, beyond the reach of her father's control, there was someone watching. A man of the land, fierce as the wild, proud as the mountains. He was no stranger to struggle, no stranger to pain, and he carried the fire of his people in his eyes. They called him the Alpha Apache, a warrior who moved with the silence of the Kila, wind and the strength of a storm. His name was whispered with fear and respect, even among those who hated him. Their worlds could not have been further apart. She, a young white woman raised under rules of obedience and silence. He, a leader shaped by freedom, survival, and resistance. Yet that night, as her tears slipped silently down her face, something stirred. It was as if the desert itself had chosen to weave their paths together. He saw her, fragile yet unbroken, caught in the cruelty of a deal she did not choose. She did not know that his steps were already moving closer, guided by instinct, by something stronger than words. Her heart thudded when she heard a soft sound outside, too steady to be the wind, too real to be her imagination. She held her breath, her body tense, fear crawling up her spine. Was it her father? Had he heard her restless pacing, her whispered prayers? Or was it something else, someone else? Slowly, carefully, she pushed the window open and let the night air wash over her. Her eyes searched the shadows, the moonlight catching the shape of a figure standing tall near the tree line. The man's gaze locked on hers, steady and unwavering. She felt it even from a distance, a pull she couldn't explain, a strength that made her both afraid and strangely safe. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. His presence filled her chest with something new, hope, or maybe danger. She couldn't decide. All she knew was that tomorrow promised to steal her freedom, but tonight held a secret she had never expected. The night stretched on, heavy with silence, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire outside and the restless beating of her heart. She knew her father would never forgive her if she stepped beyond the door, never forgive her if she strayed from the role he had forced upon her. But the thought of standing still, of waiting for the morning when she would be handed away, was unbearable. Her breath trembled, her hands shook, and in the corner of her mind, one thought whispered louder than the rest. Maybe tonight was her only chance, and as the figure in the shadows took a step closer, her pulse raced with a question she wasn't ready to answer. Would she risk everything before the dawn arrived? Or would she surrender to the fate her father had chosen for her? The desert seemed to lean in, listening, waiting for her choice. Her breath stayed caught in her throat as the figure outside moved closer, slow and deliberate. The night seemed to grow sharper around her, every sound clearer, the crunch of dry grass beneath his feet, the low sigh of the wind, the faint creak of the wood walls, as if the cabin itself could feel her fear. She did not move away from the window. Some invisible thread held her there, tied her to the man whose shadow stretched long in the moonlight. She had heard stories whispered by the townsfolk, stories her father dismissed with scorn yet never dared to challenge. They spoke of the Apache who did not bow, who carried himself like a wolf leading the pack, who met every threat with the fire of a warrior. Some feared him, some cursed at his name, but none denied his presence was powerful, undeniable. And now he was here, just steps away from her fragile world. Her father slept in the next room, his snores rattling through the thin walls. She knew if he woke and found the man outside, there would be no words, no questions, only violence. Her father's rifle leaned against the doorframe, always within reach. He was a man who trusted no one, not even his own kin, and he had warned her again and again that enemies lurked everywhere. She wondered what he would say if he knew the enemy he feared most was standing within sight of his only daughter. She wondered if he even cared, or if his mind was too clouded with greed and whiskey to see the truth of what he had done. She backed away from the window, her chest heaving, but the image of the man did not leave her. The stillness in his stance, the way he did not hide though he could have vanished into the night, it told her something unspoken. He was not there by accident. And though she did not understand why, her heart knew he had come for her. She pressed her hands to her face, shaking, trying to force sense into what felt like a dream. Tomorrow her father would sell her, trade her away like a coin, but tonight the world was shifting. She thought back to her childhood, too, the days when innocence had still belonged to her. Before her mother's passing, the cabin had been filled with a softer kind of life. Her mother's voice, gentle yet firm, had been the only shield between her and her father's coldness. But when sickness claimed her, the house grew heavy with silence and anger. She had been left alone to carry the weight of her father's moods, his debts, his bargains. Every year since, she had felt herself fading into the background of his world, until finally she was nothing more than a means to pay off what he owed. The deal he had made in the shadows was not about her at all. It was about power, about survival, about his hunger for control. Still, something inside her refused to break. She had never spoken it aloud, but deep within her lived a fire her father had not been able to snuff out. That fire burned brightest when she looked out at the open land, when she dreamed of a life beyond fences and commands. And now, with the stranger outside, the flame flared into something new, dangerous, but alive. The moon slipped behind a cloud, and darkness swallowed the figure, but she knew he was still there. She could feel it. Her heart drummed in rhythm. With the night, her mind spinning with questions. Why had he come? What did he see in her? Was it pity, curiosity, or something else she could not name? The stories had painted him as ruthless, yet his gaze had not carried cruelty. Instead, it had held a certainty that unsettled her more than any threat could. She turned from the window and sank to the floor, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. The wooden boards were cold, pressing into her skin, grounding her in. The reality she wanted to escape. Tomorrow's dawn loomed closer with each passing hour, each tick of the unseen clock. She could almost hear it, steady and merciless, counting down to the moment her father would hand her over. And yet, the memory of the man's steady eyes lit a fragile spark of hope she had long buried. She thought of running, but where could she go? The desert was unforgiving, and her father would hunt her down. The townsfolk would turn their backs, muttering about shame and disobedience. No one had ever stood for her. No one had ever given her a choice. Except maybe him. The sound of an owl hooting in the distance made her flinch, and she lifted her head, realizing how tense she had grown. She rose slowly, her legs weak, and crept back to the window. The cloud had shifted, and the moonlight returned. He was still there, closer now, near the edge of the fence. His posture had not changed, tall, steady, as if he belonged to the earth itself. For a moment she thought he might speak, might call out, but no words came. He only waited, and somehow she knew he was waiting for her. The weight of choice pressed down on her, heavier than chains. If she stepped outside, everything would change. If she stayed, the morning would seal her fate. Her hand trembled as it brushed the glass again, her breath fogging the pain. She wanted to ask him why her, why now, why this night of all nights? But her lips stayed sealed. Some things were too fragile to speak aloud. She sank into silence, her eyes fixed on his shadow until the hours dragged past. Her body ached with exhaustion, but her mind refused to rest. Memories of her mother's lullabies, of the gentle hand that once brushed her hair, rose unbidden, and she clung to them. She wondered if her mother would have told her to be brave, to listen to her heart, rather than the fear pressing in on every side. Perhaps that was what this night was meant to be, a test of courage, a chance to decide whether she would let herself be broken or step into the unknown. The fire outside her father's cabin burned low, its embers glowing like watchful eyes. The coyote cried again in the distance, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the beating of her heart. She closed her eyes for a moment, whispering to herself, trying to summon strength she did not feel. When she opened them again, the man had moved even closer. Now he stood by the fence, his hand resting on the weathered wood as if it were nothing more than a barrier to be crossed. Her breath caught once more. The world felt suspended in that moment, as if even time itself was waiting to see what she would do. Would she dare open the door? Or would she let the dawn take everything from her? And as the night stretched on, the choice lingered, unspoken, heavy in the air. The night deepened, but sleep never came to her. She stayed near the window, shifting between fear and curiosity, torn between the voice in her head that warned her to hide and the whisper in her chest that told her to move closer. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound sharper than before, as though the earth itself was urging her toward a choice. She wondered if he knew how much danger his presence brought. If her father stirred from his drunken slumber, the rifle would be in his hands within seconds. Blood would be spilled before words could be spoken. Yet the Apache stood there, calm and unafraid, as though he had measured the risk and decided it was worth it. The conflict in her heart raged stronger than any storm she had ever known. Tomorrow, her father's bargain would bind her to a stranger whose name she didn't even know. The deal was already whispered about in town, a secret that was not a secret at all. Some called her father desperate, others called him cruel. None cared enough to intervene. To them, she was just another girl, her fate unimportant. The only truth was that she would be gone, handed over in exchange for coin, horses, or maybe weapons, she wasn't even sure which. The thought made her stomach twist with sickness. Her eyes drifted back to the figure outside, and she thought of the stories. They said the Apache lived with no chains, roaming the desert freely, answering to no law but their own. They fought to keep their land, to hold on to their way of life, even as others tried to strip it from them. She had heard men spit venom when they spoke of him, calling him savage, ruthless, untamed. But the man before her did not look like a monster. He looked like someone who carried the weight of his people, someone who refused to bend to the world's cruelty. And maybe that was what drew her most of all. The silence between them felt like its own language. No words passed, but something deeper stirred, something she could not explain. He did not move to her door, did not force his way closer. He only stood near the fence, his presence alone a kind of unspoken promise. She wondered if he knew what tomorrow held, if he knew she was about to lose the last fragments of her freedom. The thought made her chest ache. She thought of her father again, lying drunk in his bed. A man who once might have carried pride, now rotted by bitterness and greed. She hated him for what he was doing, but beneath that hatred was a softer, sharper wound, the ache of knowing he had never truly seen her. To him, she was a tool, a means of survival, not a daughter to protect. She wondered if there had ever been a moment, even in her childhood, when he had looked at her and seen more than that. If so, it was long gone now. And then her mind turned to the one who would claim her in the morning. She knew little of him, only what scraps her father let slip. A man with money enough to cover debts, with hunger enough to claim what he wanted. She had never met him, but she could already feel the walls closing in. The thought of his touch, his claim over her life, filled her with cold dread. It was a future she wanted no part of, a change she could not bear. But the Apache outside, he was the opposite of that. He was freedom embodied, the very thing she had longed for all her life. Yet he was also danger, and choosing him would mean turning her back on everything she had ever known. Could she do it? Could she take that step? The question burned through her, leaving her restless and raw. The night carried on, and still she did not decide. Her body paced the small room, but her mind wandered further. She thought of what her life could be if she left. She imagined wide skies, endless land, a life lived on her own terms. But she also imagined fear, hunger, and the unknown. Nothing was certain, except that staying meant a life already written, and leaving meant a story she could write for herself. Beyond her own turmoil, other conflicts swirled. She knew her father's decision was not only about her. There were debts owed, deals broken, enemies made. This was bigger than just one family. The land itself was caught in a battle between those who wished to control it and those who would never surrender it. She had been raised in the shadow of that war, though never a part of it until now. If she stepped into the night, into his world, she would be stepping directly into that battle. She did not know what role she could play in such a fight. But perhaps that was not the question. Perhaps the question was whether she had the courage to choose at all. Her mother's voice came back to her in fragments, soft words she barely remembered. Do not let others decide who you are. She clung to those words now, trembling but unbroken. The wind picked up outside, carrying dust and the scent of smoke. She glanced again at the window and found him still there, unmoving. His patience unsettled her as much as his strength. Why did he not call to her, demand her choice? Why did he simply wait? The answer came like a whisper. Because he wanted her to choose for herself. Because freedom, real freedom, could not be given, it had to be taken. Her fingers brushed the door handle, her breath shallow, her heart in chaos. Every sound in the cabin seemed louder. The creak of the floorboards, the groan of the wind, the faint rasp of her father's snores. She froze, torn between the urge to flee and the terror of being caught. The conflict stretched tighter, wound into her bones. Outside, the Apache shifted at last. Not closer, not away, but enough to remind her he was no ghost, no dream. He was real. And he was waiting. The night did not offer her answers, only choices. And with each passing moment, the weight of those choices grew heavier. Dawn was coming, steady and certain. But the darkness still held its secrets, and she had only hours left to decide if she would surrender to fate or defy it. And as the fire outside died to ash, the tension in her chest only grew. The cabin seemed smaller as the hours passed, the walls closing in around her like a trap. Every step she took on the wooden floorboards felt too loud, every breath too heavy, as though the night itself was listening. The embers outside were nearly gone now, the fire reduced to faint red sparks struggling against the darkness. Soon the horizon would begin to change, the first pale light of morning creeping across the land. And with it would come the bargain her father had made, the deal that would end her freedom forever. She stood at the door, her hand hovering near the latch, her body trembling from the weight of indecision. Beyond the door, the Apache still waited, his silhouette steady against the moonlit fence. He had not spoken, had not moved toward her, but his presence was unshakable. It was as if he knew that words would mean nothing in this moment, that her heart was already torn enough without more voices pressing into it. The choice was hers alone, and that truth burned like fire in her chest. Inside the cabin, her father shifted in his sleep, a groan breaking the silence. She froze, her eyes darting to his door, waiting for it to creak open. But the sound faded, replaced again by his heavy breathing. Relief washed through her, but only for a moment. She knew he could wake at any time, and if he found her near the door or worse, outside, it would mean disaster. He would not hesitate to raise his rifle, not hesitate to spill blood to protect what he believed was his property. The danger was not only to her but to the man outside. The warrior who refused to bend. The night carried the weight of two worlds colliding. On one side was her father, drunk on greed, determined to sell what he did not value. On the other side stood the Apache, a man shaped by freedom and defiance, watching her with the stillness of a hunter. And between them she stood, fragile yet unbroken, pulled by both fear and longing. The tension coiled tighter, as though the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when everything would break. Her thoughts twisted back to the man who would come with the dawn, the stranger her father had promised her to. She did not know his face, but she knew enough. He was not coming for her heart. He was coming to claim ownership, to add her to his possessions. The thought sickened her, made her hands shake and her stomach churn. She imagined his hand closing around her arm, dragging her into a life she could not escape. That vision pushed her closer to the edge, closer to the decision she had tried to avoid. She pressed her forehead against the door, her breath trembling. As she tried to steady herself, the wood was rough beneath her skin, grounding her in the reality she could not outrun. Behind her, her father stirred again, muttering in his sleep. She clenched her fists, knowing that when the sun rose, his voice would no longer be slurred, but sharp, commanding, full of the authority he clung to. He would stand tall, rifle in hand, and deliver her as if she were nothing more than an object. In his trade, outside, the Apache finally moved. He stepped forward from the fence, the moonlight catching the sharp lines of his face, the strength in his posture. For the first time, she saw the glint of his eyes clearly, steady and unyielding, locked on hers through the thin cracks of the door. Her breath caught, her heart leaping wildly. It was as though he had heard her thoughts, felt her fear, and chosen that moment to remind her he was not going to vanish. He was real, and he was waiting for her to decide. The silence stretched so long that her pulse seemed to thunder in her ears. The weight of the choice pressed harder than ever before. She could hear her mother's voice in her memory, telling her to be brave, telling her not to let others decide her path. But courage was not easy to hold when the risk was so great. If she stepped outside, if she crossed the threshold into his world, there would be no turning back. Her father would never forgive her, the town would scorn her, and she would become part of a struggle she barely understood. Yet if she stayed, dawn would chain her to a future she could not bear. The first faint streak of gray appeared on the horizon, barely visible through the cracks in the shutters. The night was slipping away, and with it, her last chance. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, panic and desperation colliding inside her. She looked again at the Apache, who stood silent and unmoving, his eyes never leaving hers. In that gaze, she saw no demand, no force, only certainty. He was not here to take her. He was here to see if she would take her own freedom. Behind her, the floorboards creaked. Her father's door shifted. She spun around, heart hammering, eyes wide. The sound of his heavy steps filled the cabin, slow and uneven. He was waking. The moment she had feared all night was nearly upon her. Her hand closed around the latch, her knuckles white. Every muscle in her body shook as she glanced between the door in front of her and the shadow looming behind her. The sound of boots dragged across the floor, closer, closer still. The rifle would be in his hands any second. The air grew thick with suspense, the cabin heavy with the weight of what was to come. Her choice was seconds away, the collision of all her fears and hopes pressing in at once. Outside, the Apache stood, ready, his presence like a storm waiting to break. Inside, her father stirred awake, a man ready to enforce his will with steel and fire, and she stood caught between them, her heart pounding, her breath shallow, the handle of the door trembling. Beneath her hand, the dawn had nearly come. The deal was about to be made, and the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which path she would choose before everything shattered. Her father's voice came low and rough, still tangled in sleep but edged with suspicion. "What are you doing?" His words cut through the air like the crack of a whip. She froze, her hand trembling on the door, the truth of her fear written in the stillness of her body. She did not turn to face him. She couldn't. The weight of his presence filled the room, the stench of whiskey and smoke wrapping around her like a net. She heard him take another step, then the familiar scrape of the rifle pulled from its resting place. Outside, the Apache did not move. He stood waiting, his figure sharp against the pale edge of dawn. His eyes held hers even through the barrier of the cabin, and she knew this was the moment he had been waiting for all along. Not to take her by force, not to command her, but to see if she would step into her own fate. Her father barked again, louder this time. "Step away from that door." The command hit her ears like iron, the same iron that had bound her all her life. But as the sun cracked the horizon, spilling light across the desert, something inside her shifted. She thought of her mother's soft words, the lessons whispered when she was just a child. "Do not let others decide who you are." She thought of the man she had never met who would arrive within hours to claim her like property. She thought of years of silence, years of being unseen. Her fingers tightened around the latch. Her father's footsteps thundered closer. And then, with a breath that felt like tearing through chains, she pulled the door open. The sudden rush of morning air hit her like a wave, sharp and cold. Behind her, her father roared, the rifle clattering against the wood as he raised it. But before he could fire, the Apache stepped forward with a speed that seemed to belong to the wind itself. In a single motion, he was between her and the barrel of the gun, his body a shield, his presence unshakable. Her father cursed, the weight of his anger vibrating through the cabin, but the Apache did not flinch. His voice came low, steady, and firm, a language her father might not fully understand but whose meaning was clear. He would not allow this. The two men faced each other, one fueled by greed and desperation, the other by pride and resolve. The air crackled with tension, the rifle shaking in her father's hands. For a moment, she thought blood would spill across the threshold, thought the dawn would begin with violence. But the Apache's gaze did not waver. He stood tall, calm, his presence like the desert mountains themselves, immovable, unbreakable. And slowly, as if the weight of that strength pressed into him, her father's hands faltered. The rifle lowered an inch, then another, until it hung by his side. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. Her father's chest rose and fell, his face red with fury, but no words came. Perhaps even he understood that something had shifted, something larger than his will. The Apache did not gloat, did not threaten. He simply turned, placing a steady hand near her shoulder but not upon it, guiding her gently away from the cabin. For the first time in her life, no one forced her, no one dragged her. She stepped into the dawn by her own choice. The desert stretched before her, wide and endless, the sky painted in fire and gold. She felt the weight of her father's eyes on her back, felt the fury of the life she was leaving behind. But with each step, that weight grew lighter until it was only a shadow fading into the past. The Apache walked beside her, silent but strong, his presence a reminder that she was not alone. Though the path ahead would not be easy, they moved beyond the fence, beyond the reach of the cabin, into the open land where the horizon belonged to no one. She thought of the man who would come later, arriving to find nothing but an angry father and an empty promise. She thought of the town, of the whispers that would follow her name. She knew the road ahead would not be free of judgment, nor free of struggle. But for the first time, the choice was hers, and that truth gave her strength. As they walked, she glanced at him, the man whose presence had changed everything. His eyes were fixed forward, calm and unyielding, his every step sure. She wondered why he had come that night, why he had chosen to stand near her father's land instead of remaining hidden in the safety of his own world. Perhaps he had seen something in her, a spirit not yet broken, a fire worth saving. Or perhaps fate had simply woven their paths together at the moment she needed it most. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. There would be hardships, dangers, and choices she could not yet imagine. But as the wind brushed across her face and the sun climbed higher, she felt the spark of hope burning bright. She had stepped through fear, through chains, and into something new. The cabin behind her faded into the distance, shrinking into nothing more than a scar on the land. Her father's voice, her father's control, all of it belonged to yesterday. Now, ahead stretched a life unwritten, a story that would be hers to tell. And with each step forward, the fear that had once ruled her slowly gave way to freedom. The Apache walked at her side, silent as the desert, his presence both fierce and steady. She knew the world would call him many names, some with respect and others with hatred. But to her, in that moment, he was the one who had stood when no one else did, the one who had waited for her to claim her own choice. As the desert came alive with morning light, she breathed deeply, her chest filling with something she had long forgotten: possibility. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she no longer feared it. The night that had nearly broken her had also given her strength, and the dawn that rose before her carried the promise of a life that was finally her own. And so she walked on, leaving behind the chains of the past, stepping into a future shaped not by bargains or commands, but by the courage to choose. The story of that night would be remembered, not as the night her father sold her, but as the night she found her freedom.